Okay, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Pellom McDaniels, and I'm the Curator of African American Collections at Emory University in Atlanta. And today I want to present to you specifically on our collections related to African American artists and art historians. While our collections have materials related to African American history and life from, of course, from slavery to current, these collections, I think, in particular, relate to the subject matter, and also, while those do as well, because we're talking about the archives and how to use archives for artistic practices, but also archives in terms of memory and history. Specifically, these collections related to our artists and art historians, I think, will resonate with you if you're interested in doing research at our university. This is something that I wrote for this exhibit that we have related to Camille Billups and James Hatch, and I think a majority of you may recognize the names. The Hatch Billups Archives in New York is the home of this wonderful collection of materials related to the productivity of artists, visual artists, theatrical arts, etc. But this exhibit we have at Emory right now is really a retrospective of the development of the archive over the last 40 years and what we have at the university in terms of the Billups-Hatch collection, not to be confused with the Hatch-Billups. So let me read for you here. So archives, those which document the lives of African American artists and art historians, are essential to telling complex stories relative to the development of Black life in 20th and 21st century America. The material, cultural, and psychosocial impact of having the evidence of being and becoming, and the ability to trace the progress and transformation of a people through those gifted with second sight is invaluable. To be sure, these archives are powerful lodestones, capable of inspiring and empowering the willing and able. And so I wrote this to actually help frame the experience for our patrons that would travel through this exhibition experience, which I'll show you images of a little bit later. But I thought it was important in a couple of the presentations thus far of how do we prepare our patrons, or how do we prepare researchers to receive the archives so that they're not only respectful, that they're receptive to the messages or to the, what we're trying to impart with these individuals who interact with these materials. So to frame it in such a way that gives, that prepares, but also gives a context, I think is essential. So the Stuart Rose Library, it's recently named and recently renovated, has materials related to African American history and life. The archive started with Randall Burkett back in 1995. He's the founding curator, and really wanted to make sure that Emory, while a university in the South, and especially in Atlanta, where we have Morehouse and Spelman and the AU, Atlanta University, we needed to have materials related to African American history and life because our students were matriculating in a space that was basically white. And there were no other narratives of dissent or narratives that would challenge these well-known narratives of American history, at least in the arts and theater, in American history proper. And so the creation of this collection, inspired by Rudolph Byrd, the late Rudolph Byrd, allowed for Emory to become this repository of this tremendous amount of history. And with the assistance of Camille Billups and James Hatch, their archives in New York became the seed, the germ of an idea for the university to continue to pursue the development of the archive in the arts, especially of living and working artists, to be able to not only have their archives in our repository, but to bring them as well to have these conversations about their productivity and understand the reasons why they did the work that they did, or doing the work that they're currently doing. So in the collection, the Billups-Hatch archives, we have more than 5,000 books in the library. We have more than 10,000 slides of Camille documenting art shows from the 70s through the early 2000s, where she really documented the changing landscape of galleries and museums in New York. She also was able to account for, through the ephemera in the collection, the change from group shows to one man shows and one woman shows, but also the development of this new language around Black artists producing work, from that Harlem on My Mind show that was controversial through the Forever Free show of the 49 Black women in 1986. So her work is consistently in demand in terms of her output as an artist, but also her writing and also the artist and influence videos that we have in the repository. Again, the Billups Hatch collection is an integral part of what we have done thus far in terms of collecting the papers and archives of Black artists and art historians. In particular, Amalia Amaki. Some of you may know her work. Amalia is also a board member of the Billups Hatch board, and her work specifically deals with some of the ideas associated with memory and also this idea of descent. In this photograph that we have here on the side, and I'll share the larger image with you, she was working with P.H. Polk at Tuskegee, one of her mentors. And so this image, I think in particular, represents that idea of historical memory kind of tied up in an artifact like a photograph of another photograph, or someone's hands responsible for creating these works that we appreciate. So this kind of a assemblage, if you will, of memory and history tied up in the series of photographs that you see is not only important for researchers coming to look at the work created by Amalia Amaki, it's also looking at the history that she's attached to through the image. The work of Benny Andrews. Some of you may have had the chance to see the show at the Michael Rosenfeld's Gallery in New York, just came down in January. But Benny's work is significant in terms of how someone from the South, the Deep South, who grew up rural in Madison County, was able to take and maintain this connection to the past through his growing up as a sharecropper and through the work of his mother and brothers and sisters and father, George Andrews, known as the Dot Man, and how those works then were incorporated, or how that history and memory was incorporated into the work that he would produce in this bicentennial series. This image alone has a number of things that you can extract. The women in a circle, this is called Circle. But you have these women who are performing this ritual of removing this watermelon from this black man's chest. And so that could be read in a number of ways, whether this black man did not have this kind of manhood that was needed to be able to transform his particular space aggressively or through these kind of manly attributes, or it could be recognized as a way to, as an exorcism that these women are performing. But either way, the significance of this ritual is something that Benny carried with him and represented in this work as part of the bicentennial series. Carol Green, art historian, art critic. His papers are also very important because we have a chance to have someone who is looking at Black work, or the work of Black artists or African American artists, and critiquing that work through the lens of someone who has the historical and who has the cultural kind of foundation. And so his work becomes exceptional when you have the collections of a Samela Lewis, who is an art historian and an artist, but also Benny Andrews, James Porter, and several other artists that we have, more than 24 in the archives. I mentioned Samela Lewis. As an art historian, someone who is tracing the kind of arc of Black representation, not just in galleries, but just the use of different forms to express history and memory. The collection is very very deep, very wide. We have subject files related to different artists that she wrote about in her different publications. We also have that history of the development of what we now know as the International Review of African American Art. So we have business files as well. And we have some of her works on paper in the archives. And again, all of this material is available to anyone who wants to come and see it at Emory. You don't have to be just a scholar or a professor who have an association with an accredited university. You can be someone in the community who wants to see the works of these people that we hold in high esteem. So you're more than welcome, of course, to come and see what we have. And then finally, just for this presentation, we have the Porter papers. And so he needs no introduction to you, but again, thinking in terms of the history of art historians recording and accounting for the contributions of Black artists or Negro artists from the beginning, at least of the 20th century to date, these kinds of collections of ephemera, catalogs, materials that are, 2 more minutes, materials that are important for us to remember and also to account for moving forward. In terms of writing about these individuals and the works that they produce. So finally, in my last 2 minutes, I want to show you a little bit of how we use the collections. Beyond just storing them and making them available to researchers, one of the things that I've tried to do in the last 5 years is actually create exhibition opportunities so we can showcase the works of our artists, and especially if there are living artists. Camille Billups and James Hatch, as I mentioned, have the Hatch Billups Archives in New York, but we have the Billups Hatch Archives in Atlanta at Emory. We opened an exhibit back in September called Still Raising Hell, the Art, Activism, and Archives of Camille Billups and James Hatch. It was a wonderful opportunity to showcase their work over the last 40 years, but to put it in context. And so the exhibit is intended not only to showcase the work and the materials we have in the collection, but to place it in the context that we can share with a larger audience, to share with other artists who were their contemporaries, and also to have a dialogue with contemporary artists who would be inspired by the materials in the collections. This artist, his name is Keith Crosley. He's actually a tattoo artist that I asked to create these images based on the friendships that Jim and Camille had with people like Amir Baraka and Romeo Bearden and Sonia Sanchez and Mari Evans. And so we're maintaining that tradition of bringing artists into the fold so that we can have these conversations and continue to develop the richness of the archives. I need one more minute, okay? Faith Ringhold's poster, the United States of Attica, accounting for the Attica riot or Attica massacre, however you choose to define it, was also part of this because we're talking about artists as activists and speaking truth to power through the different forms that we have access to. They're playwright friends, Barbara and Carlton Millett. Barbara Millett just passed away a few weeks ago, if you didn't know that. Jim's work as a theater specialist, using materials for original artist installation pieces. This is the Butterfly Chapel. And in the Butterfly Chapel, you have images, some of the images that Camille took over that 40-year period of the shows opening in New York. And the butterflies represent those spirits of those friends who have passed. Also new artists like Arturo Lindsay, who's at Spelman, is also represented. So the work that we're doing is not just making this material available for researchers, we're trying to activate the space and activate the archives in ways that really create opportunities for more people to enjoy and appreciate what we've been able to keep safe for future generations. Thank you very much. My time is up.